Hello and welcome to day 5 of our First Responder Wellbeing Summit for 2022. We are here to have a fantastic conversation around what are those values and morals that bring you to work and may impact your wellbeing. Before I kick off, I would like to acknowledge that we're here today on the land of the Gadigal and Bidjigal people who traditionally occupied the Sydney coast. On behalf of Wellbeing Australia, our community online today, but also those that are dialing in later, I would like to acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are here and joining later, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. So welcome everyone. I'm Catherine Taylor. I'm one of the directors of Wellbeing Australia and really warmly welcome you to the Summit's sessions today. Now more than ever, we are really in a point where we need to take those moments and that time to pause, to focus on our wellbeing and to protect our first responders. So thank you for making that time to watch us live or online later at your own convenience. A little bit of background and information about Wellbeing Australia. We're a not-for-profit that focus on Australia as a broad nation, but also have community across the globe. So our focus is very much on proactive, positive strategies for managing wellbeing. We know and work with some fantastic providers who provide specific help in different areas. Ours is very much around that positive, proactive solution focus around how we manage our wellbeing. How do we survive and cope when things are tough? How do we have hope for the future? And how do we build those skills and strategies that are going to help us through? Our First Responder Summit that we're part of today came together with a very strong focus around living well. And we look at doing that in a number of different ways. First, it's about connection. And today's going to be a great discussion about that connection with yourself, with your own values, with your own self-concept and what is important to you. Connection is also about those around us and those supporting structures. It's around hope and having hope for the future, in particular at the moment where there is so much happening. It's really being able to believe there are better days ahead and have that focus of what hope will look like for each of us individually. And finally, it's about community, and that's coming together as a very broad community. When we talk about first responders, we see first responders as all those people paid and unpaid that are involved in formal and informal roles. So some of you will be wearing a uniform and will have formal roles as first responders that are full-time. Others of you may be community that are stepping up as first responders during disaster or are involved in volunteering, and also family and friends of first responders. So we welcome you all as part of that first responder community. As we go through the session, any questions or comments are welcome to be put into the Q&A section, and we will do our best to go through as much as we possibly can. So today I would like to welcome Mark Layson. Mark, welcome to join us. Thank you for sharing your insights.
No worries. Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to the next hour or so as we have a bit of a chat and think about perhaps a new way of understanding ourselves and the things that stress us.
Absolutely. Beautiful. And today's session, that's a really good way of framing it. Today's session came from some of the conversations we had in last year's summit around moral injury and values and the importance, and people saying, can I get some more help on what that looks like, what that feels like, and what that means? And Mark comes to us with a beautiful broad background coming from police, firefighting, also AMBOs, is involved in chaplaincy and supporting with your fantastic support dog, Wallace. So you're heavily embedded in that first responder community, Mark.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't seem to get enough of it, it seems, over the last 30 years, been in and out of organisations. So,
and it's a common theme we hear, people moving between agencies and everything. So I think it's beautiful that you can bring that breadth of experience. When we're talking about moral injury, when we're talking about values and ethics, what is it that has drawn you into that area? What has attracted you to the conversation?
Look, there's been a few things. I think, as you know, I was 19 when I joined the police, then went and worked as a fireman, and then 10 years as an ambulance chaplain. And hearing my own experiences and hearing the experiences of others, there was something about it that was deeper and wider, I guess, than the trauma exposure in itself. And then I was speaking to a mate of mine who's a naval chaplain, and he mentioned the idea a number of years ago of moral injury. And we had a great conversation. And then I looked into it more and more and went, wow, that's happening in the military, but no one's thinking about that in our space. Because from what I'm feeling and what I'm hearing from people, this is really relevant and we need to think about it more. And I'd also done a bit of research previously on moral philosophy and moral psychology. Why not get to moral injury? And one thing led to another, and it felt like I kind of had been led down this path for many years without even knowing it. I found myself doing a PhD on moral injury and emergency workers. So confluence of all kinds of things.
Yes, and we appreciate it. So I'm going to hand over to you to be able to share with us your insights, and I'll pop in with some questions along the way, but really looking forward to your sharing on this topic. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you. I'm going to share my screen with people. There we go. Hopefully you can see my screen.
That's perfect.
So today, what we're going to do is some of the findings of my research, and it follows along with what other research I've been reading has been saying as well, and some recent productions that have come out of the States as well about how we might manage our well-being on the pole of morals and ethics. And you can see I've just changed slightly for the really attentive from not just your workplace values and ethics, but also your morals. And we'll talk about the difference between those in just a little while. Catherine and I just had a chat about some of my background. Here's me with my service dog, Wallace. Wallace came to me because he was just too bouncy to be a guide dog. Instead, he's very friendly, and he comes with me, and I work in an aero medical unit and serve as the chaplain there with Wallace. And as one of my friends say, you know, when he looks at me as a team, he says, one of them is a hairy mammal who's motivated by food, and the other one's a dog. So Wallace and I work together really well and open up all kinds of conversations. As I said, I've worked as a police officer, as a firefighter, and as an ambulance chaplain now for 10 years. I've also been an ordained Anglican minister running a small parish in the inner area of Sydney, but now I'm particularly devoted to doing my research. And I've got some great partners who are helping me with that. I'm doing it through Charles Sturt, but the New South Wales Centre for Work Health and Safety are helping fund this project as well, so that we can embed some of the findings in organisations. So we're going to talk about ethics and morals, and we're going to try and work out what it looks like to be able to revisit those so that we don't actually go down a really negative path that is dangerous or destructive to ourselves and our loved ones. So I want to start with a question now. I've said a little bit about me. I want to ask a question of you. There's Roger Daltrey and the gang from The Who with a very important question: who are you? If you're somewhere in the Western world, you may well answer by telling me your first name, not your family name. You might tell me your occupation and not your employer's name. You may tell me your hobbies and your habits, or even your personality. You might, all the extroverts are wanting to get on and go, I'm an extrovert, and all the introverts are going, I'm an introvert, just leave me alone. Or for the bold of you, you might tell me your political affiliation or even your religious affiliation. And they're all really important questions and they help define us. But I want to dig a little bit deeper today. Not what you do, not your family or your personality, but what you believe. Not necessarily your religious beliefs, but what you believe about yourself, your purpose, your identity. What are your beliefs about the world? What some people call your just world beliefs. What do you think should happen in the world? What do you think is the way it should work? Because we tend to have these mindsets, but we don't always make them explicit. What is your inner moral code? What are your moral expectations? And how will you keep that rather than throw it away? So at the moment, I'm just teasing this out just to get your juices going a little bit, because later on, I'm going to ask you to take a few minutes to start to think about what that looks like when you start to make that explicit so that you can keep it.
It's an interesting question, isn't it, Mark? Because I know a lot of our attendees in our community say, I am police, I'm a police officer, or I am identifying as a nurse or whatever, but I identify through my profession and don't often think deeper. So it's a really fascinating way you frame that, where it's really starting to unpack that belief system beyond that, what role I play. Yeah, and,
it's funny, I'm sorry about the sort of the gendered language here, but, the profession I've been a policeman and a fireman and a clergyman, and my wife is an accountant. She's not an accountant woman or an accountant man. We don't have that. It seems to be something very much that is far more definitional about these roles that we have. They can take up so much of identity, and it's a really good identity that we can have because we do so much good within the community. And that's a fantastic identity. The trouble is it's a two-edged sword. When you have a really positive identity, if you start to lose that, that can be really destructive if it's a really important part of who you are and what defines you. And I know that's been part of my story. So I wanted to start by just unpacking a little bit that there's something different between morals and ethics. They overlap, but they are a little bit different. Imagine I said to you, what you've done is unethical. You might raise your eyebrow and think and go, was it? But if I said to you, what you just did was immoral, it ups the ante quite significantly in the way that we think about ourselves and what we've done and the destructive nature of the things that we do. Ethics are the things that we have that organisations put on posters and they put on their office on the wall. Or it can be something significant like the 4 pillars of bioethics. But these ethics, they help regulate our relationships with people we don't know particularly well and have little affiliation with. It might be the patients who come and go, or the people we deal with in our work. And ethics really deal with what is it good to do. Morals asks, what is it good to be? It's about virtue and it's about character. These are the things that are written on our soul. Not just do I do good things, am I a good person? And this is kind of important because breaking ethics can find us as being guilty. I actually think guilt is not necessarily a bad thing. I don't want to live in a society where people don't feel guilty. Yeah, I just kicked your dog, but I don't feel guilty about it. We want to live in a society where people feel guilt, but can have that assuaged. The difficult thing is with morals is it leads us to shame. Not just I've done a bad thing, but I'm a bad person. I'm not worthy. I'm not important anymore. I'm not the person I once thought I was. And so we're thinking about our moral framework and the phrase our moral expectations. And they're really, really important for us to think about because they are us at our most central. And emergency work challenges our morals, I think, much more significantly than other people's work. We come across conundrums that people could only ever dream of when we are dealing with life and death situations and seeing people both at their best and at their very worst. So for now, I just want you to get your juices going and thinking who you are, and I'll unpack that a little bit more and help us to do something where we can make that more explicit. And so we'll return to that exercise. But the reason that I think this is important is what I'm finding in my research and in the literature is that it's important to make the implicit, the tacit, the things that we hold inside much more explicit. Dr. Dean Baker from the University of New South Wales, the military ethics and leadership expert, he's been quoted as saying this, that individual people who join the military, he's working in a military context, of course, need to clearly understand their moral framework and belief system because humans are better able to cope with morally challenging environments when we understand who we are. And gosh, don't we get some morally challenging situations in emergency services. And he said that's the difference between an individual who returns from a deployment morally injured and an individual who returns unharmed. Maybe whether or not they can answer, what do I really believe? Who am I? Where do I belong? And what is my purpose? He goes on to say that soldiers don't really get this at Kapuka in amongst the push-ups and the sit-ups. And I know that doctors don't get it from state health departments nor from their university. As I said, they might get the 4 pillars of bioethics, but your moral code and expectations that you bring into the situation. Paramedics don't get it at university or training colleges. Police don't get it at their academies. And as a firey, I certainly never got it in my training regime. And so as I talk, I want you to start to think about your framework. And later on, we're going to actually do that. But let's go back to something a little bit personal to try and centre some of the things that might cause us to need to visit this. The Harbour Bridge here, I'm sorry if you're not in New South Wales, but this is my place. And this is where I was a police officer in the Rocks Patrol at the gateway to Sydney. And the Harbour Bridge and the Opera House was my beat. I've walked and scaled all over this thing. I've ridden bikes, driven cars, gone to accidents there, done all that kind of stuff. But I want to tell you 3 different events that occurred on the Harbour Bridge that might paint why this is important. The first one is I attended my first suicide at the foot of one of the pylons of the Harbour Bridge. I was pretty young. I joined when I was 19, and this is the first time I'd seen something as traumatic, the first time I'd seen a dead body. It was a traumatic event for me in that sense, objectively, it was traumatic. It didn't really disturb me as much as I thought it probably would. But it was something that started to feed into my experience. It was one of those drips in the bucket. But just around the corner, sort of in the bottom corner, just around here where my little circle is going, is a set of wharves that used to be derelict when I was working there. And it had a number of homeless people who lived in it. They had very meagre possessions, but they were damaging the pier. And I knew they were trespassing. We got tasked by our sergeant to go down and remove them. And that's all good and well. They were trespassing, they were damaging property. But when I got down there was something about it. It was these homeless people and their only meagre possessions we were essentially destroying. Everything that a person owned, and something just didn't sit right with me, even though I knew I was justified in what I was doing. It didn't sit right. Another incident that I recognised was just at the foot of those pylons again. I was on a Saturday night cruising around in the car with my partner, and we both saw someone in the boot of a car. And we looked at each other and went, that wasn't right. It triggered something in us. And anyway, we reversed a little bit, but by the time we got back, the person had gone and he'd taken off into the darkness under the harbour bridge there. I hopped out of the car. My partner said he was going to drive around the top and meet me, and I started chasing on foot the person. I'd lost them for just that briefest of moments. Anyway, caught up to them at almost the same time at the top of the hill as my partner came around, and we found someone. He had priors for stealing cars. We thought, okay, we've got this guy. Took him back to the station, and of course he denied it. He didn't have any property on him or any implements for breaking into cars. The issue was we didn't have a continuous and unbroken pursuit. I had to really be able to prove beyond reasonable doubt. I had to say I'd had an unbroken pursuit. I'd seen him the whole time, and it was definitely him. I was 99% sure that this was the guy. But then again, we had to lie to just get that little bit past. And my partner and I tussled with the decision, do we actually lie to get this guy? And we made the decision between the two of us, it's not worth doing that. We don't want to change who we are. So that was some elements of morally ethical situations that I found myself in. Now, one that's a little bit different, just around the corner from my experience, is the Phillips Foot restaurant. Our police station used to essentially back on to the bistro area, the outdoor bistro area and the barbecue, and we had our Christmas parties there. One year at the Christmas party, I was standing there next to a newly minted sergeant. There he was, he'd just been promoted, and the boss, our chief inspector, was also at the barbecue. There was me, the sergeant, and the boss. And I heard the chief inspector start to hold court on how he should start to lead. He said, of course, you can't be friends with them anymore. And he said, and if you're going to be a good sergeant, you've got to crush them like grapes. These constables, you've just got to crush them like grapes. And I remember standing next to him thinking, wow, that's an interesting perspective on leadership. And I found that in a number of leaders in all kinds of organisations. It was the crush them like grapes paradigm of leadership. And I know when I resigned from the police to go to the fire brigade, the same chief inspector, I got told, go up to see the boss. I went to see the boss and he said, all right, I'm obligated to ask you to try and to stay, because he really meant it. And I remember leaving the police quite disappointed. I think I did an all right job. I wasn't Sherlock Holmes. I wasn't going to get huge awards, but I did my job competently, and I was really quite disappointed. These are two different, the Phillips Foot and the Harbour Bridge are two different ways of actually seeing some things about moral injury, about the way we deal with our own moral conundrums and how we make sure we don't cross our own boundaries. But then there's also the idea of what does the organisation and the culture do to us, the things that might break us. And these are the kind of events that every first responder would probably recognise. And my research is trying to help me to understand their role in suffering and anxiety that we can suffer through being a first responder. So I want to start with a little techie bit, explaining a new way of understanding what's going on with these different thoughts in our minds. By and large, our organisations have bought into the storyline of the direct causal role of trauma with distress. You've seen something yucky, you've got PTSD, we'll send you off for some CBT. And while trauma is vitally important to understand, there's perhaps some more to the model that we need to be able to understand. Because its impact is the impact of trauma is mediated by other things, and I think particularly our moral code. It's what I say is the moral, relational, and spiritual context in which we experience these things. And one of the people who was earliest to think about this was Veterans Affairs psychiatrist Jonathan Shea. And in the mid-90s, he produced a book called Achilles in Vietnam, where he recognised the experience of Vietnam veterans was much like Achilles in Homer's epic, the Iliad. And he said veterans can usually recover from horror, fear and grief once they return to civilian life, so long as what's right has not also been violated. He started this idea that perhaps that it's not trauma per se that is the problem, not necessarily and logically the centre of the problem. It's connected to it, but there's bigger organisational factors going on that we need to start to take account of. I'll define some of the terms about moral injury in a second, but for a start, I'll say it has that feeling of betrayal by others, your organisation, your managers, that Phillips Foot kind of experience where you attend an event and then you think your organisation has your back, but they don't.
It's an interesting question. And sorry, we've just had a couple of questions around, do you think this, and it's really interesting that not being violated, do you think this has been impacted with the pandemic? Do you think people are being exposed to and experiencing more significant trauma when a lot of these first responders were already seeing quite significant trauma, but the pandemic's taken things to a new level? Have you seen that?
Oh, absolutely. Certainly overseas, the experience in terms of needing to ration ventilators and resources was really difficult. But you've certainly seen, and you know, with people, there's been all kinds of moral and ethical things that have been really difficult. You know, when you hear that nurses have been attacked or had their property attacked because they've been working in COVID locations or because they've been involved in doing vaccinations, or when medical staff, I'll leave aside the rightness and wrongness of vaccination because I don't want to polarise people, but when people who have deliberately not been vaccinated and I'm being forced to treat them, and I felt that was the right thing to do. And of course, the other side, I don't feel it's right to be forced to do this, to do my job. I can still do my job and I shouldn't be forced to do this. There's other elements around the way the organisation treats us. Russell Roberts and a team from Charles Sturt University released some research about what were the things that were really distressing for first responders during the pandemic. Now, none of them involved, well, not the highest ones, involved watching people slowly drown on their body fluid. You know, there was things about organisational resources. And, you know, we know the shortage of PPE, personal protective equipment at the start. It was also ineffective or redundant communication. It was leaders not being there present. These were the top 5 factors, all had to do with workload, with uncertainty, with communication from leaders. They weren't those kinds of things. Although there were other things, you know, other morally difficult situations weren't necessarily the illness, but that we were denying their loved ones being next to them as they died. You know, that sacredness of that moment when someone passes from this life. They were the doorkeepers preventing people. And that was really morally challenging for people. You know, when they start to imagine this could have been my father, it could have been me. And I think those kinds of things. And a number of other different things have been difficult through that time. And, you know, we came off the back of a bushfire and we've ended it with a flood. But it's still going to kick along. So I think it has really picked up during the pandemic. I wasn't sure if you were unmuting yourself.
Sorry, Mark. No, and the feedback is that that's absolutely right. And it's interesting, those things you refer to, because a lot of media particularly has emphasized that the core role. And so seeing death and seeing illness and that. But what you're talking about is actually that aspect of that purpose. So coming back to that question you posed before about what is my purpose and where do I belong in that, and that sense of disconnect from there. So thank you for sharing. That's excellent.
Yeah, no worries. And it's been going for such a long time and the weariness is all mixing in with it, you know, and so we've got things like trauma, burnout, betrayal, compassion fatigue, all these things just sitting in the mix. So I'd love to say I've got the silver bullet, but I think I've got another piece of the puzzle here as we're talking about it. But what Shea noticed about this is the really acidic effect that this sense of betrayal, the breaking of social trust, has on our own morals and ethics. There can be a trajectory where we come in with quite high ideals to these really caring professions that do good for our society, and we can track down. For the soldier, it's the keen young recruit to the possible war criminal at the end of being able to justify all kinds of action as they see themselves descend. For an emergency worker, it can be that slow downward spiral from the keen young rookie who's keen to save the world and who's 10 foot tall and bulletproof, to the burnt out old veteran who's sick of going out on patrol or can justify all kinds of shonky actions. So in his next book, Shea wrote about what that downward spiral can look like for veterans once they return to their environment. And of course, we're a bit different from war veterans in that we're always in our environment, aren't we? We don't go off to battle and then come home. Our battlefield, our patrol is quite often within our community. But what he noted was what happened to character. And you'll notice there's a couple of different kinds of endpoints that he describes in the way that it can destroy or damage our character and the way we behave. He said this breaking of social trust deteriorates their character, their ideals, ambitions, and attachments. And they begin to change and shrink. When social trust is destroyed, it's replaced by the settled expectancy of harm, exploitation, and humiliation from others. I'll just pause there because I remember when I joined the police being told by one of those slightly burnt out old senior constables, never turn your back on anyone because they'll either stab you or do something else unpleasant from behind. That sense, that settled expectancy of harm and exploitation. And he says, with this expectation, there are a few options. And these are the two different things that he points out. Strike first, withdraw and isolate oneself from others, like Achilles did, or create deceptions, distractions, false identities, and narratives to spoil the aim of what is expected. So stop and notice that these in ourselves or our loved ones, or perhaps a manager or commander that we might have. Perhaps my commander, who was crushing them like grapes, had travelled down that trajectory some way. The first one is that angry, cynical, resentful attacker. You might recognise your loved one returning home and just angry all the time. You might see it in colleagues. They weren't always like this, and they've descended. Or it's that one who's an avoider, never quite committing to something and just trying to isolate themselves, socially isolate themselves so they don't get betrayed again. Many managers and first responders are like this. And I think it's quite ironic that perhaps at the moment of maximal cynicism is when they get promoted to the point where they are going to be in control of other people's careers and work lives. And, perhaps when your manager is having a go at you, you might see one of these different personalities and not only try and deal with that, but extend a bit of sympathy that perhaps they've travelled a journey and they haven't done as well, and make it your goal to not end up like that. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But sadly, many head down these paths. And today I want to say we can avoid such a fate. If we are deliberate, there's a possibility of growth and not descent. It scares me a little bit that we might believe that being exposed to trauma or betrayal is, well, that's all she wrote. That's the end of my career. It's the end of being a normal person again. But actually, it can, if we're deliberate, make us grow. It can make us more profound people. And I talk about quite often on paramedics in Australia. Every state except for Tasmania have the Cross of St John on them. And on their shoulder, they have 4 points on this cross, and they were traditionally symbolised justice, faith, temperance, and fortitude. These aren't the kind of character traits that are really promoted on Bachelor in Paradise. So our trite world doesn't see them as important, but we all want to know someone who has temperance and fortitude, don't we, when the times get tough? And what I see in a lot of emergency workers is that their temperance and fortitude and faith and justice are expanded, and these people are just absolute giants of character, because that's where our experiences can go. And that's where I want us to be able to head today, by actually re-examining stuff. So I don't know if there's any other questions so far before we get into another little techie bit.
More so around the interesting, that clarity that you've provided around that strike first or those creating deceptions. And it's more family members that are sort of saying that they've seen that in their own space with family members who have come back. And it may not have been around the point that a significant sort of trauma happened that they can pinpoint, but they have noticed those change in behaviours and that character shift. And so people are sort of questioning, and I'm guessing you may be coming to this, but that link between that moral injury and PTSD or depression and those other symptoms? And is there a correlation there?
Yeah, look, there definitely is. And I've got a nice little diagram I'm going to show you in a little while that these things do actually really cross over. But it is so often our loved ones who notice it more than we do. We just think we're being normal. If we're angry, we're just angry. And we sometimes displace that anger. We're angry at things at work, but we come home and we kick the dog. That's, technically it's displaced anger. And that can start to rule our lives if we don't get technical, if we don't get specific about things. So let's move on. Let's actually define. We've seen what some of the things that the effects of moral injury and betrayal can be. So let's actually just quickly define what those things are. Now, there's two definitions that really stand out in moral injury. There's no consensus definition where everyone has agreed this is what moral injury is, unlike PTSD. What moral injury is, Shea described it as this: betrayal of what's right by someone in legitimate authority in a high-stakes situation. I want you to note, first of all, the context of this high stakes. He was talking particularly in the military, but I think the emergency world is high stakes. Military, it's kill or be killed, but here it's life and death. And we have quite high stakes, and we have quite an expectation of those who are in authority. And they can quite often, we can feel like being betrayed, that we've been betrayed by them. So that's one element, and it's what we might call other-focused moral injury, that someone is acting on us. But the other influential and important definition came in 2009 with Brett Litz and company. They wrote that it's the lasting psychological, biological, spiritual, behavioural and social impact of perpetrating, failing to prevent or bearing witness to acts that transgress deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. And so here we have that sense of a self-focused, that I've done something that has crossed my own boundaries. And it's a little bit different. So we have these self-focused and other-focused, and they can, of course, blur lines. And sometimes when we feel betrayed, it makes us go down that line where we then cross our own boundaries and our own lines. But this sense of crossing our own moral boundaries and expectations. So it's important to understand them, because sometimes we cross a boundary and we know something's wrong, but we don't know what it is. And we don't know how to attend to that and deal with them when they're small. Now, I want to be really clear here that there's organisational changes that need to occur, and I'm working on those. But the context for today is not about organisational change, but how can we be deliberate in our own well-being? And trust me, I am working on those things for organisational responses, because things need to change. But today is about what we can do proactively. So I'm going to focus on that in particular.
And that holistic approach that you've just shared, that it's not one aspect, really links with a number of the other speakers that we've had who have been saying about, from a well-being point, we quite often try and put things in one bucket as such, whereas we need to be considering all those different aspects. So a number of attendees have shared that link and that breadth to the spiritual as much as the social, and all the diversity to it, rather than just that's the label you get.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you can see in that definition, there's a thing called the biopsychosocial model, which says that, that we're affected by biological processes, by our social context, and by the way that we think. One of the things that's added here, and I'm going to spend a bit of time on this in a little while, is that idea of spiritual, because particularly with PTSD, it's been almost completely missing. But moral injury wants us to attend to that. I'm going to talk about what it means to attend to that spiritual element of us. Now, if you're saying, oh, look, I'm not religious, so that's not me, just hold your horses, because we're going to get to there and actually try and separate those two in our minds so that we can understand it a little bit better. But moral injury is something that is still growing in the research. This is a diagram I love to show. Nikki Jamison, who's just finished her doctorate in moral injury and suicide in soldiers in Australia, so it's really relevant here, has done a really good job of showing some of the differences between moral injury and PTSD. You can see just in the middle, the anger, depression and anxiety, those kind of things are quite common to both. Self-medication with alcohol and drugs and distrust, withdrawal, all those different things are quite common to it. But here what you've got in moral injury space is when our conscience is violated, where our spiritual, our religious focus, where what we might have believed about the world changes. There's grief and sorrow, regrets, self-blame. Now, it's a big list, so I've tried to split up what I think are the really important things. When we think about moral injury, it really taps into that idea of guilt, shame, and outrage. And as I said before, shame is that really, it's so heavy on us, and outrage at what has happened. And it's saying the world is not fair. Whereas PTSD is much more a fear and anxiety element of what's going on, that the world is not a safe place. And if we were to think about that, how that impacts our world, moral injury is largely about the past. It's ruminating on the past, retrospectively thinking, I should have, they should have, why didn't they? And it can hold us back. PTSD is about now and the future. Is it safe to be here now? Is something going to be dangerous for me? I know as an ex-police officer, I still like to sit in the cafe or the restaurant so that I can see the exit, so I can see who's coming in and out. It's part of my little ex-police neurosis, but that's something that is a good way of thinking about what's going on with moral injury and PTSD. But as I said before, that idea of spirituality, and some of you may be a little skeptical when we get to this. And so I want to just unpack this a little bit because I think spirituality is possibly the most compelling and yet the most difficult thing to talk about in moral injury. And here's my last techie bits for today before we get into some more practical stuff. I'm wondering how you actually picture spirituality. Perhaps for you, it's that idea of going into a church or a mosque or a temple, lighting a candle or saying a prayer. Or perhaps it's a negative thing. It's that creepy or austere priest from your childhood. Perhaps you're a little bit cynical of people who don the $250 Lorna Jane lycra pants and go and do their 30 minutes of lycra and have ticked off the spiritual bit for the day as they do their yoga at sunrise. Or perhaps you think it's the loopy aunt at family reunions who laces her conversations with all kinds of apocalyptic language, and you just want to steer away from it. But perhaps it's something really central to you. I actually think that it's something that is in all of us, that spirituality isn't necessarily, it's not linked to superstitions, it's not linked necessarily to religion, but it does overlap those ideas. It gets confused quite significantly with religion. Now, sometimes religion is the way people express their spirituality, but spirituality, think of it as a much bigger category in which religion is one way of expressing it. Religious affiliation is one way, but there's lots of people who might say now they're spiritual but not religious. And we all maintain a spiritual element to us. Within the palliative care world, where death and dying is front and centre, this idea of spirituality has been going around for quite some time. And they produced what is a consensus definition on what spirituality is. And you can see I've got 3 words highlighted there. It's the way we seek ultimate meaning, purpose, and transcendence. Am I worth it? What's my mission in life? What am I here for? What is the world about? What makes it fair? It's the way we experience our relationships to society and to self and to family. And so you can understand when this is attacked, those shrink, don't they? And so our experiences of relationship, but even, more than just that, nature or the significant or the sacred. And it's expressed through not just practices, not just doing a half-hour lesson or meditation or mindfulness thing. Those things are good, but through our beliefs and values and the things that from our upbringing. And so it's a bigger category that people fit into in one way or another. It's the way we understand ourselves in the universe. For some, it's expressed through traditional faith. For some, it's experienced through nature. It's not necessarily formed rationally, but it doesn't mean it's irrational either. It's more intuitive, much like morality. So many forget that the moral and ethical elements of our spiritual path. And it's really important for us to think these things through, because our moral code is very close to being very closely linked with our spirituality. And so here's the last definition kind of thing, the last techie bit. I'm glad I'm to the end of this. So your morals are your personal and shared familiar and cultural societal rules. They can be tacit, they can be hidden, or they can be explicit. And they're the fundamental assumptions that we each hold about the way the world should work and that we should behave in the world. And so when our morals get crossed, the way that we think the world should work, it just doesn't seem like it's fair anymore. And so spirituality is intimately connected with our moral framework. And so what you believe about justice in our world and how it transcends our workplace codes of conduct, it can force us, the things that we do, to sometimes re-examine our code. I think of those who work in the ICU when they're forced to give treatments to their loved ones because they're being told you've got to do everything you can. A terrible story of a lady who was on a ventilator so badly ill and immobile that the blood was coming through the ventilator and spraying through the walls, and the doctors and nurses were forced to keep doing that work because the bioethics demanded that that's what they should keep doing. I've found vulnerable people. There's something about cardiac arrest. If someone who is a 62-year-old obese diabetic has a heart attack, it's sad, and we go, that's sad, but too bad, so sad. We move on. But if it's a 2-year-old who's been run over by its mother and gone into a traumatic cardiac arrest, it pushes different buttons in it because the world shouldn't work that way. And so we find ourselves in a conundrum when our world that we may not have expressed properly starts to crumble. So that's the techie bit. And we get to a point here where you might go, wow, like Troy McClure, you go, it's like you've known me all my life. And you've discovered something new and interesting. Or you might be saying, so what? Yeah, okay, all right, next, please. It's important to know that information, that background information, to be able to do what I want to do now, is to move to a point where we put this into practice and how we can try and protect ourselves and keep our well-being. And one of the way I like to describe it is like this. This is a 1971 Ford Falcon. I think of myself as a 1971 Ford Falcon because I was born in 1971. And I'm sorry for the Holden fans out there. 1971, I can't change how old I am, and I carry the dents and scars from having experienced trauma, betrayal, a life that has got me to where I am now. And I hope I don't look like this. This is a 1971 Ford Falcon today. And perhaps these are the people that Shay describes as the attacker or the avoider. And we don't want to be in that place. What I'm hoping to do today is get us to this point. This, again, is a 1971 Ford Falcon. This sold last year in 2021 for $1.15 million. And I was fortunate enough to go and have a sticky beak at it where it's now displayed. I think if we are deliberate, we can get to this point, that we can't change the model year that we are, but we can change the expression of what that looks like. And the step from either that to that is just small steps. To get to here, it's the small dent that we don't attend to. It's the small scratch. It's that little patch of rust. It's that failure to do a service where we get to that particular point. And to get to this point, it's a series of small elements. It's nothing big and revolutionary necessarily, but to get to this point, it's a series of small steps, and that's what I want to think about. And because I want to be as inclusive as possible, I have put a 1971 Holden here, 1971 Holden Monaro, just a bit of car porn for you Holden fans so that you can just keep holding on. So here's the point where I want us to do what Dean Baker has urged us to do, to actually think about who I am, what I do, where I belong, and what my purpose in life is. So that's what we're going to do. But that might be a bit of an odd thing for you to think about. So I've put here a French philosopher sucking on his jeton cigarette with a beautiful supermodel who's munching on a croissant or a crepe, walking the streets of Paris. That's what we might think about, this existential element of what's my moral framework. We might think it's beyond us. We don't have to get to that, okay? It's actually a really important practice that we can all particularly do. To do some thinking about who we are. We don't have to be a French existential philosopher to do this. So I want you to think about now, if you've got a piece of paper, maybe you can write something down or you can text yourself if you've got your device or whatever. But to start to sketch out something that you might take an extended period of time to work out and even talk with your loved ones about, and to be able to start to express who you are and what the shape of that might look like so you can come back and revisit it. So I'm going to tell you a little bit of myself. Now, I'm saying this because this is what I aspire to, not what I am. I wish I was this, and on my best day, I might get close to it. But this is what I see as the way I tick. And there's a number of different categories. And so as I do this, you might just jot down some of those words to give you a bit of a framework. So the first thing is the things that I value. I value loyalty, honesty, and self-discipline, although I often lack it, particularly with chocolate. I value the idea of self-reflection that, as someone criticizes me, I can go, okay, well, let me think about that rather than attack back. I value mercy, which is an element of justice on the kindness and love end of the spectrum of justice. As I look at myself, I don't want to throw people under a bus. That's the way this unpacks itself. No one likes to be thrown under the bus by someone else, and I aspire to be someone who doesn't do that. I want to say what I mean and mean what I say. So I aspire to be, this is the kind of person I aspire to be, someone who's gracious, forgiving, and strong. And forgiving and strong don't always seem to sit together. I know giving food sometimes to the people I was charging with criminal offences and saying, don't mistake kindness for weakness. They were still people who needed care and love. And so I wanted to be both forgiving and strong and hold those two things in tension in my life. And because I'm so often wrong as well. And I know I need forgiveness and grace from other people. And so who am I to judge other people? So what I think about the world, ultimately, I think the world is unfair and broken. My deep personal faith has pushed me to a place not to go to a monastery and to contemplate that and to escape it, but to engage it full on. To go, there's things in this world and I want to use what I've got to make it better. The French theologian Henri Blacheur wrote that evil isn't there to be understood, it's there to be fought. And so I want to fight a good, clean fight. And overall, I guess I have a little saying in my own mind that I want to leave things better than I found them. I want to find a job or a role that I'm in, somehow improve it before I move on. And that's me. As I said, I wish I was that every single day, but I know I'm not. And it's those points that I need the forgiveness and mercy and grace of others. So I try to be to others what I would like them to be to me as well. To do unto others as you'd have them do unto me. So that's me on my best day. And so what I want to do is give you just a few moments, and maybe Catherine and I will talk while you do this, or is to think about it for yourself. What does it mean for you to have values and purpose in life? What does it start to look like? To start to unpack that. So just take a few minutes and start to pack, the things that you value, the things that you dislike. I know I dislike 3 different personality types: bullies, show-offs, and sycophants, people who suck up to other people. And so I don't want to be those things. Sometimes it's important to see the things you don't want to be, as well as the things you aspire to. So have a bit of a think about those things just for a few minutes, and it just kickstart the process for you.
There's some comments come through, Mark, in terms of that link between compassion and being strong. And I know Jacinta Ardern speaks a lot about this as well, as don't mistake my compassion and kindness for weakness. And I think that's a really new concept around leadership. And I think it's something, as you say, when we look at organizational structures, that's an evolution as to what do we perceive and understand leadership to be. So it's really interesting to hear you share that as well, because it's often associated back to being a very female trait and all of this sort of rubbish, as you say, about stereotypes. So very interesting from that. And the other question that's come through is, do you believe morals change throughout our lives? Is this something we should do at certain points throughout our life? I mean, that you posed 3 really critical questions a minute ago. Is this something we should revisit? Are there moments that change throughout our, life phases?
Look, that first one, that being compassionate and strong, I think that's absolutely true. I think, when I think, it's made me rethink the idea of forgiveness, because compassion is really quite often linked with that. And it's challenged me. And we sometimes confuse forgiveness. We think, if I forgive someone, that doesn't mean that earthly justice shouldn't be done. When I think about a number of people will probably have quite significant traumas in their life where people have done criminal activity to you. That point of forgiveness doesn't mean that you forego the necessity of that. It doesn't mean necessarily that you will be reconciled and now you've got to treat them and just smile. And it may mean that. And at points, there are many things that will do that. But it does mean foregoing something that you owe, that you won't resent. And if you think about what the opposite of compassion and forgiving is, it's resentful. And resentment is, that famous old saying, resentment is like drinking poison and expecting your enemy to get sick. forgiving and being compassionate costs us, but so does not forgiving and being compassionate. Yeah. And look, and I think with our moral code as well, yes, it changes. I think it has central elements to it. But I know as I grow, my moral code at 50 is different than it was when it was 20. I've adapted more information into it. I've tried to keep the central element of what is me. And that's the point of, I love this idea of cultural intelligence. There's a great YouTube clip on cultural intelligence about what is most centrally me. And the trick for us as we get older is we make everything me. The way you dress, the way you talk is really important for me. Whereas when we're younger, we don't care about those things. And we tend to have more things that we're inflexible on. Whereas I found that actually I'm more certain of the person that I am, and the things that are indifferent to me are the things that I can let go. And so, yes, I think our moral code can, if we go in the right direction, it can become more flexible and pliable to different situations. And I think we need to take more information in, but revisit our code so that we don't lose the entire sense of ourselves and what is most centrally us. So, yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you.
All right. So we've had a bit of a chat, and maybe you've started to write things down, or just us talking distracted you. I don't know. But you've got a bit of a framework to think about that in the next little while. Maybe do it with a loved one. Take some time, make something special of it. Go, we're going to go away for the weekend, get the kids babysat. We're going to go away for the weekend, and some of it is we'll think about our own moral codes and how we can build each other up. But what I want you to think about now is, once you've got that, how much would you sell it for? What's the cost of your soul? How much would you sell your soul for? And perhaps you would go $1 million, or it's not for sale. That's who I am. I can't sell it. But the great irony of moral injury and that descent of character is that we give away to our enemy that which we wouldn't sell for $1 million. We give away our moral code. And let me explain how that might particularly work. Let's imagine you've been working for an emergency organisation, you come to work, you give over and above, you stay late and you don't claim overtime. It's become an identity for you. You're living out your moral code, and it gives you satisfaction. So you regularly do the unpaid overtime, you make sure you do everything really well, you dot your I's and you cross your T's. And your family has suffered because of it. You're always on call. And you have this now expectation of what the way the organisation will work for you, that they'll recognise that, and that you'll get the promotion and you'll get the shift. You've worked ridiculous hours, you've put yourself at physical risk in the middle of the night, and you have these expectations. But then it doesn't quite go the way you think. A complaint comes in. And I used to find the more people you arrested, the more complaints you got about you. It was funny about that. The more work that you do, the more that people complain and get annoyed with you. It's the people who stick their head up that get shot. And perhaps it's not the complaint. You're not even consulted when an investigation is being done about your activity, and you feel like you're swimming in treacle against the organisation. They don't give you any understanding of what's going on. If they're either investigating you for a particular thing, or you find yourself with an injury. And after 20 years, you find yourself being cut adrift and a different return to work coordinator every 2 weeks. And you think, I thought they had my back. Or perhaps you make an error, an honest error, a mistake, and you again find yourself in that system where it feels like the Nuremberg trials have started and they're targeting you. Perhaps a hospital administrator or a registrar or a senior manager makes the dumbest of decisions that limit your ability to work. You know the moral code, but you're not allowed to do it because the boss says you can't. You can't do your job effectively and safely because of it. Well, then you go for a promotion or that transfer and you don't get it. And you think, I've risked my life. I've done all this. Why would I bother doing all this other stuff? And then, boom, it's the moment that you switch. You go, well, I was working according to my moral code, but now I'm not. I'm going to let them determine the way that I live and that I work. It's what Kevin Gilmartin describes as trading your personal ethic for a situational ethic. And we sell our soul. We actually give our soul away to the people that we hate. And it's at those moments that it's actually worth coming back and going, well, I'm not doing this for them. I'm doing this for me. And it's really important for us to be able to revisit it not just in the big crisis moments, but regularly, maybe even weekly, fortnightly or monthly, set aside a special time to go, where am I being challenged in this? Where have I been able to express this? Because we do get quite pessimistic, we can, and forget that actually I am doing this each and every day. When I did that particular arrest, when I saved that person's life, when I did this, I was living out my code and going, that's great. And let's think about those things. Where are the points where it's challenged so I can come back and revisit it? And where I need to change some of those elements because new knowledge and new information has come. And so that's really important so that we don't sell our soul in that moment and go from I risked my life, I thought that they would have my back. Now, I don't mind not checking the pack. I don't mind taking a ream of paper at first. I don't, possibly getting to the point where you do something criminal and you assault someone because you've been treated poorly and you treat other people poorly. And we find ourselves, our character, we become the attacker or the avoider. And we never thought we would. We become the crashed out old 71 Ford Falcon and not the restored 71 Ford Falcon. So look, the end point is, what I want to say is we need to be deliberate. Again, Kevin Gilmartin describes this really, really well in his book, Emotional Survival for Law Enforcement, to be a specific survivor and not a vague victim. And look, there's lots of particular tactics and techniques that we can do. Now, we're probably getting close to time, Catherine, so I don't know if I can really unpack many of these. But there's some things here that we can be doing to be able to do to specific things that can help us in our code as well as we keep revisiting our code.
And I think these points you've got on screen are so important, Mark, and they go back to what you've mentioned about that small step, so that noticing things as they're happening so we don't become the disheveled one, but very much about being deliberate in those small steps. So for those, and there's the couple of people who are saying, it's where do I start? What would be your one or two tips on this list that you would say are good starting points for people to consider if they've taken those questions and unpacked them? Where would you say they go next?
Okay. I think one of the things here is this one, get someone you trust. One of the best things that happened that I was most fortunate with when I joined the police was my best mate joined the police within 6 months of me. And we were just able to unpack life. We didn't have to go into the details of what a particular event was. We could say, look, I went to a suicide today. Okay, know what that is? All right. And we could just talk freely. Brett Litz actually talks about in his article about having a benevolent moral authority, someone who has your back, and he talks about having a chair and talking to them and unpacking those things and imagining them forgiving you if you've done the wrong thing. So, but, I had a close mate who I trusted implicitly. And I think that's really important, that social connection. Get someone that you can trust, that you can unpack that stuff with. I think sometimes draw a line on the right side of ethics. What I'm saying here is sometimes you've got to draw a line around your organisation and go, all right, I can't act out my whole code in this organisation. It's just too destructive and toxic. But I will give them what I owe them. I will work these. And I sometimes advise people, well, do your acts of goodness that you want to do in another organisation. Join a volunteer organisation. And one of the things that does is it allows you to live out your code in a different place, but it also broadens both your identity. One of the things I did when I was in ministry in a tough time is I went and joined a water polo team with a bunch of middle-aged blokes, and we just had a great time and another social set of people as well. Allowed me to volunteer and help and do a few things here and there. But creates a broader identity for yourself as well. Because if that identity is solely found in being the police officer, the ambulance officer, the rescue person, the doctor, the nurse, all those different things, and you lose that, you've got nothing. But if you have a number of different things, and this is really important when you retire or leave as well, that you've got another identity that's there for you. And notice those slight acts, those small acts. The journey of 1,000 miles starts with one step, and the journey downward to that burned out old ex-white Falcon it's a series of little steps. And notice it when it's small. But take that time and be specific about it. So they're some of the particular things.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. And totally agree, because we do have a lot of volunteers online joining us as well. And that broadening identity is a really key one that can often help us to also get that trusted relationship, right? So sometimes the trusted person is someone like one of the chaplains in where we work, or it is a best mate or something like that.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's someone we haven't met yet. And it is that alignment that I think gives us that hope. So thank you so much. So many words of wisdom in there to contemplate. There's a number of phrases you've referred to that I just think are so critical. The things like compassion fatigue. And I'm really sensing that in the community at the moment, where it's such a relentless environment, as you mentioned, with all those factors, that compassion fatigue has really kicked in. But guilt isn't all bad. Guilt is actually a healthy feeling, and it's what we do with that's really important. The connecting with forgiveness and in alignment to spirituality, I also thought was a really interesting point I'm definitely going to ponder more on, and that post-traumatic growth. So I think that, combined with that fantastic visual, which we will share with everybody, that really clarifies the difference between moral injury and PTSD, is a nice way of being able to better articulate that crossover, but also that differentiation. And I notice up on screen, you've just shared with us a number of other resources that everyone can tap into if they're wishing to find out more.
Yeah. Look, I tried to split it up into different media because we all have a different preference. A book, if you're interested in a good book, read Achilles in Vietnam. It's a great read. It might push you on to think more if you're a book person. If you YouTube, here's a little thing. I think maybe we'll have the link somewhere else, but Dr. Bill Nash talks about moral injury and about what is he was one of the co-authors of that LITS article that I've mentioned a number of times. An interesting that's just come out in the States, it's only come out this year. It's called the Power Manual. It's a practical thing. And one of the elements in it is they're asking people to do a very similar thing to what we've just done today, and gives some pushes a lot further. The guys who have done that have really experienced researchers and practical people. They've worked in police organisations for a lot of years, but it also transfers across to other organisations. And another interesting one, if you like podcasts, Moral Matters. This is two doctors. In particular, if you're in the healthcare world, it's really relevant to you as well. Check that out. That's really good. I'm just sort of going back over old episodes now. And you can contact me as well if you want to reach out and hear some of the things that I've been talking about.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Mark. I will ask you just to take your slides down so I can share some contacts if anyone is feeling that they need any support.
Yeah, I'm aware I talked about some pretty heavy things in there, and I think it's really important. And
it's also, do you know what? And we share this with everything that we do, because as you've mentioned, sometimes we actually do need help and we don't realize we need help yet. So in terms of where we're going next with the summit, I'll share more about what our next and final session is, but we do have a series of workshops where we can continue to unpack and understand these things. So coming up in May and June particularly, we have a detailed workshop following through on exactly what Mark has spoken about today with Mark Crossweller around connecting with those values and ethics to benefit your well-being. So that will be more of a practical workshop to continue this discussion. Kerry Howard will be talking to us about how we can proactively deal and manage that stigma and that fear of reprisal in terms of where I'm at and how I can manage forward. And finally, Graham Bint is going to be talking to us about PTSD and how we move that trauma into thriving. And it's interesting, a number of what Graham talks about really connects with what you've spoken about, Mark, today as well. And it's something we're noticing more and more is in terms of people feeling the feedback they're getting from some traditional channels are often that, you know, you have PTSD and you will not recover. And we really hope people can realize that's not the case. It's about looking at things differently and tapping in and identifying. So if you or your loved ones are feeling like they need support, on the screen at the moment are some contacts and resources for you to be able to reach out to. All of the conversations that we're having around wellbeing and the topics that we discuss can evoke and provoke certain memories. So we respect that. If you are feeling you need help, we really ask you to reach out and seek some support. If you are at a loss and not sure where to go, please contact us and we will help to direct you. Thank you so much, Mark, for your time today. Coming up for our final session later on today will be Desley White and Inspector Alison Fenwick talking about that career change after crisis. So we hope everyone can join us for that. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mark, for your time. And thank you for all your sharing.
Thanks for having me.